Dear guests, allow me to welcome all of you. Allow me to welcome Ivan Krastev, political scientist, the chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia and Permanent Fellow of the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna. And I would like also mention that Ivan Krastev is contributing opinion writer for the New York Times and author of many books, for example, Democracy Disrupted, or probably the last book, After Europe. And I'm very glad that we have this opportunity to speak about current situation in Europe very shortly after the European parliamentary election. Allow me also to mention that this meeting is organized by Massarykova Demokraticka Academy under the auspices of Vice Chairman of Chamber of Deputies, Tomáš Hanzel, but I want to excuse him because today we have to be in Ostrava and Karviná. So it's for the beginning. And now I would like to recall, Ivan, your article, one of your last articles in the New York Times, and I remember that this article had a headline, "What do Europeans really want?" And it was something against conventional wisdom, because in this article you opposed the common opinion that now we are facing here in Europe tribal war between populist and nationalist on one side and committed Europeanist on the other side. If I have this, that you said in this article that the biggest group of Europeans is still those who are skeptical about both the European Union and the national state. And maybe you also stated that what is going on is not the mainstream moving to the fringes, but voters moving in all directions from left to right, from anti-system to mainstream, the constant crossing of ideological borders. Maybe it seems that in, as you said, in 2018, we have migration crisis of voters. And I want to ask you now, after these elections, do we know better or more? What do Europeans really want? I would like to ask you to start with this first question. Yeah. So,
first, thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity, but to be honest, it's quite a big risk. I used to know a very smart, wise Bulgarian politician who told me people are normally paying higher price for the stupid things that they said the first 24 hours after the elections than for the whole pre-election period. Because this is the only thing that basically people remember. This article was very much based on a big survey that European Council on Foreign Relations did in 15 countries. And Czech Republic was one of them. And then basically we tried to see what was the voters' preferences. And there's several things that struck me. I'm just going to give you 5 of them and to try to see how it was reflected in the vote. Normally, when you try to talk particularly about not your own country, which you know well, you try to imagine that this is going to look like the countries that you know best. And all of us best know the United States these days and the United Kingdom. Because they're covered all the time, because they're basically in the media. As a result of it, there was a major assumption that European politics is totally polarized. Like in the United States, basically you have a very clear pro-European camp, you have a very clear anti-European camp, and they're fighting each other. Listen, this is true for only one European country, and this is Poland. Poland is really like this. In Poland, basically moving from the government to opposition, or from the opposition to the government, is like crossing a front line. I was talking to the mayor of Warsaw, who had a 10,000 people panel before the local elections and tried to see over 6 months how many of them are going to change their vote. Out of 10,000 people, only 2 persons changed their vote. So, but this is Poland. This is not the case for most of the other European countries. What we discovered was that out of the 50 people who declared that they're planning to vote, 15% said, we don't know exactly how we're going to vote. And then, out of this 35% of the voters who said, we have decided how to vote, 70% said that they are discussing changing their vote. And paradoxically, it can go in all directions. For example, in Austria, the voters of the Freedom Party were saying that they can vote for Kurz in a much higher percent than the voters of the center-right voting for the far-right. So for us, this was the first thing that we discovered, is that European politics on the eve of the elections looked like a city center in which suddenly the traffic lights were switched off. People move in all directions, you don't know where they're going to end up. And listen, if you see to the election results, to a certain extent, I do believe that this was not a wrong predictions, because some of the expectations that, for example, there are going to be overperformance, for example, of the Alternative for Germany, because normally this kind of parties are doing better on the European elections, it didn't work. But at the same time, you have look at how people are voting in other places. People are really moving between parties. Small parties coming up. Liberals and the Greens happen to be the biggest winners. Nevertheless, this was also interesting to see to what extent the green wave does not cross the east-west borderline. Very strong in Germany, very strong in Austria, very strong in France this time. The second thing that came very much to us is that if you listen on one level to President Macron, on the other to Prime Minister Orban, this was going to be a referendum. And basically Orban said it's going to be a referendum on migration, and Macron said it's going to be a referendum on Europe. Yeah. And my argument was it was not going to be a referendum. And this is not going to be a referendum for the following two simple things, which I do believe also, if you go on the vote now, you're going to see. First, on migration. When we went on the surveys, we discovered that there is only one country in which migration comes as the issue number one. It's not that people don't care about migration, but it was only one country in which people said that this is the most important issue. And this country was Hungary. Not because there was many migrants, but because of the very strong media situation around this. But the most important reason, migration being not as important as many people believed, is the following. First, the number of the people that came to Europe declined dramatically. For the last year, there are 120,000 people who came. This is the number of the people who landed in the Athens airport in a single day of August. So this has nothing to do with the images of thousands of people crossing borders, of what is happening. So this is not 2015, it's not 2016. The second reason is that basically there is no major party in Europe these days that advocate open borders. None of the major parties, both left or liberals, are going openly to say we keep the open borders. Strengthening the external borders of the European Union has become a common position. But the third thing, and here Czech Republic is the only exception, by the way. For the first time, we asked people, what do you fear more? Emigration, which means your own people leaving the country, or migration, foreigners coming? Czech Republic is the place where people much more fear people coming, but also Czech Republic is one of the very few Central and East European countries in which you do not have a high number of people that have emigrated. But here is the result for the other countries. For Poland, Romania, Hungary, Italy, Spain, and Greece, the fear of your own country living, your people leaving the country, is perceived as a bigger problem than the others coming. And just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, in Romania for the last 10 years, 3.4 million people has left the country. This is a country of 20 million. Out of these people, 70% are younger than 40 years. Just for the last 3 years, 10,000 Romanian doctors has left the country. By the way, Bulgaria has a similar number. To the extent that in countries like Hungary, the same, by the way. Hungary, almost 1 million people has left after Orban came. Not because of Orban, because of many other things, but this is the data. I'm saying this because suddenly the emigration appeared to be very important for some of the member states. And this was one thing that nobody was really very much discussing. When it comes to Europe, this is the second reason why it's not going to be a referendum on Europe in the way Macron was talking. Unlike in 2017, there is not a major European party that is asking for exiting the European Union. Forget about Farage and about United Kingdom. This is a different story. neither Marine Le Pen nor Salvini asking either for exiting European Union or exiting the euro.
Yeah.
This is a major difference with 2017, when you have 15 parties in the European Union who said, we ask for a referendum, we should leave the euro or we should leave the European Union. So because of the fact that you have this type of a new consensus on Europe, so the populist nationalist party said, we don't want to leave Europe, we want to take it over. And on the other side, there is no kind of an open border party there. I do believe this explains why the referendum idea didn't work.
But what does it mean, this change in position of Marine Le Pen and to disintegration? Does it mean that we are not facing the danger of disintegration? I would like to recall one more, your very, very known the sentence you said that we have something like special experience of the past, 1989. Then when we discovered the fragility of political things. And at the same time, in your book, After Europe, you are saying that there is a danger of breakdown of liberal democracies in the periphery. But at the same time, you are saying that the problem of disintegration will not start if these peripheral countries are running out. The problem is if something happens in France and Germany. That's why my question is, if it is that now that this problem is not so big, and how do you assess current development in France and Germany? Because in France, it seems to me a big question what will happen in the future.
No, I very much agree with you. In a certain way, my also idea always was, and I hope I'm wrong, that you don't need to have an anti-European parties in order to destroy the European Union, because basically the big projects like the EU collapse in the way a bank collapse. What is a run on a bank? Out of the fear that there are not enough money in the bank, people go and try to take their money out, fearing that if they're not going to do on time, there's not going to be money for them. And there is not a bank that can resist the bank run. So from this point of view, there are, for example, governments who said, I'm not against the EU, but I'm afraid that it is going to end up badly. So now we're going to follow policies that are going to put me in a better position if we're out. This was, interestingly enough, by the way, confirmed by the data. When we ask now people, do you trust the European Union? You know also from the Eurobarometers and others that confidence in the EU is higher than in any other period for the last 25 years. At the same time, the majority of people in every single country, with the exception of Spain, said that they fear that in 20 years they're not going to be European Union. I'm saying this because it's Euro-pessimism and not Euro-skepticism that comes about a bigger issue. And here comes France and Germany. I was always very much afraid that France and Germany can be a bigger problem, and if you basically look at the latest, what happened yesterday night, you're going to see it. First of all, the data on France was absolutely devastating. 65% of the French believe that nothing works. European Union does not work. National government does not work. Highly, highly nostalgic. The life was better before. Our kids are not going to have good life. And because Macron made Europe the major part of his appeal and agenda. So this is when people are saying, oh, but Marine Le Pen also won 5 years ago. 5 years ago, she won, and of course Hollande was doing much worse than Macron, but one never said that for him the most important is European Union. He didn't make himself the symbol of the European kind of reinvention. Well, Macron did it, and this is a symbolic victory, and this symbolic victory for Le Pen is going to hurt him. And then you have Germany, and what happened in Germany is not simply that Mrs. Merkel went under 30% and lost votes. But keep in mind, she decided to put a German as the leading candidate for the EPP, believing that the fact that you have a German candidate is going to mobilize more votes. They're going to be a patriotic vote. It's going to be a pride vote. It worked in Netherlands. Timmermans made a miracle. Basically, the Dutch Socialist Party was dead and he resurrected it. They ended up as #1. It didn't work in Germany. Basically, Mr. Weber, who by the way is a very nice person, it's not about who is nice and not nice. The problem is that in Bavaria, the Christian Social Union got the worst result that they have ever got. So from this point of view, the weakness of Germany and France is critically important because, and this is my analogy always, I know that analogy is idiotic and it's not an analogy about political system, but when people go closer to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, they're going to see one thing. It was not in many cases that nationalism destroyed the Soviet Union, because nationalism in many of these republics came as the result of the disintegration and not as the reasons for disintegration. But the story which was important was that Baltic republics ran away. They were occupied places, but it was the decision of the Russian Federation that they don't want to pay for Central Asia, that they're interested in the optimal union, that they want to keep only Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, that basically unlocked the process, which basically after that ended up with what we have seen as a total disintegration. So the biggest question is, could it be that Germany at some point is going to ask the question, are we interested in the European Union? Are we ready to pay for everybody? Particularly how we can do it if France has a very different views than us on what to be done. And France is asking a different question. Where are the borders of the European Union? Are Bulgarians really part of it? What about others? There are not many French investments in some of the countries. So this is what I do believe is still relevant in this analysis.
But how are we able to ask this, to respond these questions? Because probably the result is a fragmentation of European politics, and probably it will be very difficult to compose now and to create strong institution. But we need very much strong institution now. Now that we are losing in this fight, China against US, and at the same time we have to face and to start to play some political game in current world. But it seems that after similar result, are we probably not equipped to manage this geopolitical game?
Have a real enemy, these disciplines. For example, when there was so much a pro-European parliament, for the pro-European forces, the pressure to play together was not as strong. Now, when you're going to have a majority, which is going to be 56–60%, you need much more discipline and much more kind of an agreement on certain policies, because you are pressed very much, and there's going to be a much stronger presence of the populist right than before. And it's not about numbers. I can see people saying, oh, but the numbers have not increased so much. For the first time, the populist right is a pan-European phenomenon. Before, it was the national parties. They didn't much cooperate with each other. Many of them were considered as a protest vote party. They go to the European Parliament, but they never had the feeling that they have enough strength to influence the agenda, so they were just performing for their national audiences. Now, Salvini basically today made a statement that he will make an attempt to create as big as possible united group for the anti-immigration right. He said we can go up to 150 people, we can have Orban, we're going to have Farage, we're going to have Le Pen, and we're going to become big enough. I'm surprised for this. Probably you have seen that, for example, the leader of the Polish right, Mr. Kaczynski, said that he's never going to enter coalition with Marine Le Pen because Marine Le Pen is paid by the Russians and he's not going to work with them. So from this point of view, it's easy to make a statement to cooperate. If nationalists were cooperating so easily, probably even the World War II was not going to happen. But the story is that at the same time, this is a totally different phenomena. And for the first time, these parties are not simply stronger in the European Parliament, but they're governments that they control. And you know much better than me that it's totally different to have members of European Parliament, but not to have a government that is supporting your idea. And it's totally different to have 4, 5, 6 governments that are doing this. From this point of view, Austria was an interesting case because there was a lot of talk about the Austrian model. And of course, I can imagine that because you're politically interested people, you have been seeing the famous video of Mr. Strache developing certain ideas about how politics should be done in Austria after the elections and the strength of the blonde power. But the interesting story was, the question was how people are going to react to the decision of the Prime Minister Kurz to break the coalition. And here's interesting. Kurz was not punished for making a coalition with Strache, and he was rewarded for breaking the coalition. In a certain way, basically, he went 5 or 6% up. Strache went at around 17.18%, which shows you that these parties are not protest vote anymore. There is a very strong constituency which is going to stay with them. Nevertheless, what's happening in the case of Austria, to a certain extent, Freedom Party is the new Workers' Party. If you see people who are voting for them and the profile and so on. So this is an interesting story. So, and also on fragmentation, it's not simply that you have a much more, you're going to have probably a majority of 4 different groups. This is also the cohesion of the groups. The EPP are famous for claiming that in the last parliament, in 92% of the cases, all sister parties voted the same way. My question is, how true is going to be in the next parliament? How cohesive are these groups? How often, for example, the Romanian Social Democrats are going to vote with the other socialists on rule of law issues? How often Mr. Orban, if he stays with EPP, is going to vote together with the Germans? So the fragility and the volatility of the situation, in my view, has increased incredibly, and this is much more important than to see how many seats one or the other party is taking.
That it's impossible now to say if this election could be something like a new start, new beginning of it. What will follow will be something like continuation of resentment and malice in Europe. I remember that you one time you said that in 2014 in Europe was diagnosed as mental disease, autistic. You spoke about autistic disorder, and the question is if we are able to overcome this. For example, the turnout was higher. Now it seems that maybe in politics we have new incentives, new movements, and then the question is what will follow? The melee, or there is some chance for new start?
No, first, I never was very deterministic in politics, because I do believe one thing that particularly political scientists, we don't like to talk about is how important the personal factor is. It is also about leaders. Look at the situation in Spain. By the way, classical situation where before the previous elections, you have a situation that very much looked like Italy. The 2 major parties of the center, the People's Party and the Socialist Party, being in a major crisis. And then on the left, you have Podemos, and then from a center-right, you have the Citizens, Ciudadanos, and basically it could have easily ended in the way like ended in Italy, in which the 2 major parties basically disappeared. And then you have the Sanchez effect. And he basically doubled the result of the Socialist Party, which many believed that it was doomed. And on these elections, you can see also the People's Party managed to regain some of the positions that they have lost. When people believe that everything is predetermined, that everything is a trend, I don't believe it is. It very much depends also on the performance of the political leaders, how they communicate, what they were doing. For example, Bulgarian elections was very much by this. 2 weeks before the elections, major scandal concerning scandals, one of those most politically sensitive scandals, people in power getting cheap apartments, people don't like it. And then you basically believe that opposition is winning. And then the Prime Minister basically was going around the country for 2 weeks, talking to the people. The governing party won with 6%. Is this structurally predetermined? No. So from this point of view, for me, the first big story is the European leaders are going to bet on strong leaders at this moment and what these strong leaders are ready to offer. Because one of the differences between the populist parties and the mainstream parties is that populist parties are starting to come with leaders. We can like or dislike them, but at least we know their names. Salvini basically became very popular for certain type of constituencies with very simple messages. Prime Minister Orban, was building a name. Most of the names that we know in the center, with the exception of the French president or Mrs. Merkel, are people, particularly in the case of Mrs. Merkel, which is coming at the end of her career, not in the beginning. The problem is, who are those leaders which are going to be identified, which people can really go with, and that can send the same message, which otherwise does not work if there is nobody to tell this. And I found from this point of view, neither pessimistic nor optimistic. It depends on people and it depends on certain decisions. I find somebody like Mark Rutte a strong figure. It depends. Him being or somebody whose name have never been heard by anybody, who is going to be put on a position, and even if he's a very kind of otherwise nice person and intelligent person, simply cannot go with tough decisions.
We know the leaders who will win. I would like to recall that in today New York Times, the main article is why Trump will win the next election. And we know who are these leaders. Narendra Modi in India and Duterte was a victor in regional election now,
Yeah.
and Netanyahu, and also in Australia, it is the same story, and Nigel Farage and other guys, and I can summarize that we have many similar leaders which are raising and which are starting now.
No, but listen, there was also Macron, who 2017, he played this role positively. He came from nowhere. Nobody basically believed that he had a chance. He believed that he had a chance. Look at the Greens. In a certain way, what the German Greens did yesterday is historic. Getting more than 20% in such a structured political space, and not simply coming. The story is that the energy is not simply on the populist right, but the problem is how you're capturing it. Because there are people on the streets for different causes. Of course, it's much easier for some of the populist parties because they basically stay on the negative agenda only. We have been joking with the colleagues that the Greens and Salvini type of populists, both of them comes as saviors, but while the Greens wants to save life, basically, the populist right wants to save their way of life. And this is where basically they differ. But on the other side, politics is about passion. And I more and more believe about this. Look at Farage. He comes. The two major parties cannot, for a period of 3 years, decide where they stand on Brexit. And in order to keep the parties not to disintegrate, they're basically just balancing, not taking position, not taking position, not taking position. The moment when somebody comes, and this was also true for the Liberal Democrats on the other side, who took position, people say, I at least know what this guy wants, or girl. And part of the problem of the people in the center was that for a very long period of time, in order not to lose any voter, it became so confusing that nobody of the voters remember anymore why they're voting for these parties. It was too much balancing. And this is something new. I was just looking at the results, how the elections were going to look if only people younger than 35 had been voting. And this is the biggest problem for the center. Most of the centrist parties totally depend on older voters. Younger people are looking for the more radical solution. Nevertheless, on the left or on the right, but they want something to happen. For them, just keeping the status quo is not an option.
So to mention one thing, you told me that I know that you devoted time and energy also to Russia. And, and maybe it will be some book in October with Stefan Holmes.
Yeah.
And you also visited Russia. How it looks like with the passion in Russia?
Listen, being Bulgarian, I'm kind of born expert on Russia. But Russia is also interesting to look at. And this type of an energy issue, because to a certain extent, if you see Russia, you're going to discover three things. First, that there was a moment in which people are pretending that Russia is very weak, it does not exist, we go with the economic performance, which is of course negligible. And And then suddenly people decided that Russia is very powerful, very strong, and they solve all the problems. And if you read some of the Western media, they're electing American president, deciding on Brexit. I was always joking, if the Russians can elect the American president, probably we should basically cancel Bulgarian elections. Because if they can elect American president, obviously they can elect also Bulgarian president and probably the Czech president. So why I'm saying all this? Russia looks very strong because you have a Putin factor. There is a strong political leader who played very strongly a weak hand. But behind Putin, we don't see the state. We don't see the society. And what you're seeing is the following. After the Crimea, there was 1 or 2 years of a very high energy. We can like or dislike this nationalistic energy, but the energy was there. And now when you go to Russia, you're going to see this type of a lack of energy, which I remember from the late socialist period, which means cynical people, cynical about the world, cynical about their own system, cynical, of course, about the West. And as a result of it, to a certain extent, the strength of Russia comes from the fact that we try to explain all our problems, try to find the external reason for why we have these problems. By the way, the Russians have been doing this for all the years after 1991. There is no single person who is protesting on the street of Russia, which the Russian government is not going to be told that it was paid by the United States or paid by the European Union, as if somebody cannot go on the streets of Russia to be unhappy on his or her own. From time to time, we go in the same direction. Listen, before these European elections, there was a very little social media activity outside, not only Russians, but anybody else. And what shocked me in the famous video of Mr. Strache, in which he's talking to a lady who is offering big Russian money to go and to help his party for the elections. Listen, if you really have a good Russian connection, this conversation is impossible. The story of the far right being totally captured, I mean Austrian far right, being totally captured by the Russians. If you really have this connection, first you probably can check that this need does not exist. You probably can secure the money to do what you wanted. So we're becoming in a trap of our own. And I'm afraid of this trap because I have seen how this basically is used by politicians to explain their own problem and lack of doing things that they should have done as an outside influence. I don't believe that Russia is doing so well. I don't believe that Russia is doing so well economically. I don't believe that basically Russian society is so much behind their leader in the way we're talking about. Russian society is exhausted society. For a certain period of time, they really like the fact that Crimea come and Crimea is not there. But talk to them about Eastern Ukraine these days. Not much patriotism, not much interest. They said foreign policy is fine, but what about our pensions? It appeared that the increase of the retirement age was a much bigger problem to the government than the protest in 2011, 2012, because it went through a type of constituencies that were very supportive for the Russian government. And people said he lied to us. During the whole presidential campaign, he didn't mention once the pensions, the retirement age being increased, and then suddenly during the World Championship in football, with the hope that nobody is going to notice, you're increasing the retirement age. And people don't like this, and they don't like it in Bulgaria, they don't like it in Russia, they won't like it anywhere. So from this point of view, I'm afraid that from time to time, we're not interested in the places. We're getting certain figures to play a symbolic role in our politics in order to make our life easier.
I would like to mention two societies which are probably not exhausted. I am speaking about China and United States. This clash probably is one of the main challenges in current world. And the question is, what should we do if China and Russia battle? It's probably one of the main questions where the new representation of this new EU institution will have to solve, and it's probably a fundamental question for current Europe.
Totally agree. I had the opportunity to be the second half of the last year in the United States, and it's interesting to see how over a period of 3 months, China basically took the role which Soviet Union had during the Cold War. And this is not about Trump only. This is a consensus between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. For example, Senator Schumer, who is the minority leader for the Senate, is as hawkish on China than the United States. And from this point of view, it comes, of course, it has some very important explanations. One is basically China ended up to be the biggest beneficiary of the trade regime that the United States has created. Secondly, suddenly, many people, particularly in the strategic community, say, if we're not going to stop China now, we're not going to stop them ever. And this is changing the relations between China and the European Union. Because when the Europeans talk about alliance with the United States, we don't mean much about alliance about China. For many Europeans, basically, China is not the first thought. But for the Americans, if there are going to be alliance, this is going to be based on a common policy toward China. 5G comes very high in these conversations. And this is interesting to see that, and this was also my surprise with the American policy towards Europe. You see that President Trump is quite supportive for people like Mr. Salvini, for people like Mr. Orban. But at the same time, neither Mr. Orban nor Mr. Salvini are ready to join the United States when it comes to America-China policy. Italy was the first country that signed the Belt and Road Initiative of the G7. Hungarian government twice vetoed common European policy with respect to China, perceived as being anti-Chinese. So from this point of view, in a certain way, while the European debate is still kind of not ready to try to see the new relations between the United States and China, and we pretend that this is simply Trump and this is basically Trump-China relations, I agree with you. One of probably the most important decisions that Europe is going to take is where we stand on this in trade terms, because for Europe it's much more about trade than about military terms, about the relations. And this is not going to be an easy decision. It's not going to be an easy decision, particularly for some of the East European countries, because, let's put it like this, Chinese has not stolen a single Bulgarian technology. Probably because we don't have one, but we don't have some of the problems that the Germans or Americans had. So as a result of it, from the point of view of the public opinion, and don't forget that public opinion is playing much higher role in the foreign policy, many people don't see China as a threat. People are ready to talk about Russia, they're ready to talk about Turkey, but I agree with you, the bigger change is China.
But we have to know that we are not neutral in this dispute, because U.S. in the position as Donald Trump as president is hostile also to us. We are also the target. We are also the target of bipartisan bullying from the side of Donald Trump. That's why it's probably not so black and white.
No. When I said that it should be taken decision, it does not mean that it's clear what decision should be. Yeah. But it's not a position that you cannot take. And I agree. I do believe President Trump, there are two interesting things about President Trump. Probably more than two, but these two that are interesting for me. He's the first American president who believes that the real war is the trade war. Nevertheless, that he talked about the very high military budgets, you're not going to see him as a classical hawkish military president who is interested in wars. For him, military power and military budget is much more the way to put pressure during the negotiations than kind of the idea to go on the security solutions. He's going to escalate, but the moment when you come to the possibility of clash, he's going to basically go back. This was true on Syria, it's now you can see this on Iran, it was on Venezuela. He's not easily using military force. There were previous American presidents much easier doing this. I'm saying this because for him the trade war is a real war, and the real American enemies are countries that has a trade surplus with the United States. So from this point of view, he said, why Russia is our enemy? There is no trade surplus. Why Germany is our friend? They have a huge trade surplus. And for us, it's very difficult to understand why he's saying this, but this is not simply that he's saying, he believes it. And I agree with you. He believes it, I don't know. There was a book which I'm strongly recommending to you, which is a very old, just when Trump was elected. There is a Cambridge historian called Bernard Sims. And he wrote a simple book only good historians can do. He took all the interviews that Trump has given from 1980, when for the first time he gave a political interview, to the day when his campaign started, but not the books, because the books are co-written, they are other people, just the interviews. And he was asking just one question. Are there some consistent beliefs and ideas that go all these years and never changed? And he found 3 ideas that President Trump never changed in his life. First, trade is a zero-sum game. In order for me to win, somebody should lose. And everybody who is saying that it's a win-win is lying. And the biggest problem of the American foreign policy, according to him, is that the Americans cannot distinguish anymore between the victory and defeat because they try to pretend all the time that nobody is losing. Secondly, and this is also very much Trump, he said, you cannot be victorious if the defeated party is doing better than you. He said, how we know that we have won in the Second World War if the Germany and Japan are living better than us? So for him, basically winning means that you should live better. And certainly it was Iran. It was interesting. Iran was also very much present as a threat. And this is due to the fact that he started to be interested in politics in 1979, 1980s, when basically the hostage crisis was taking place. Humiliation. So it's about pride and humiliation. So he was changing his views on everything, but on these 3 things, he never changed his views. And this is interesting for this zero-sum understanding of the world. And if they're friends, they should pay for the fact that we are basically defending them. These books that you're mentioning about this with an American colleague of mine, Stephen Holmes, it's very much about imitation. And why basically the Clinton administration, Obama, believed that the world that is going to imitate the United States is going to better world. So democracies don't fight each other. Trump, coming from business, he said, imitators are the worst competitors. If democracy is so good, why we're giving for free? No business person is giving his competitive advantages. There is something wrong with giving for free people that otherwise benefit us. This is a different way of seeing the world. And in a certain way, I do believe it starts with the moment when America does not feel powerful enough in the way it was feeling before. So many Americans was ready to basically share this view. I was always interested because Mr. Trump has a lot of qualities, but being a nice person is not one of them. And I'm not saying it in an ironic case. He's never pretending to be a nice person. So maybe it's why people who are not interested so much in political ideologies, certain voters jump to support him. And here's my feeling. People select Trump in the way you select your lawyer, not your political leader. When you have a problem in life and you need a lawyer, you don't go for the most highly moral lawyer. You go for the dirty lawyer if you believe that he has a record to defend you. And I do believe that his play, I'm dirty, I'm doing this, and so on, instead of appalling his voters, is something that attracts them because they believe that in this moment in which America is under pressure, there is a major competition, you need a different type of a leader. And this is an interesting story because as a result of it, America is totally polarized. But this is why when it comes to China, it's not going to be type of a negotiations that we had, for example, with the US before. So now China, when it came big in the American debate, he frozen the tariffs on Europe, the talk. But the idea is, are you going to stay with us against the United States, or do you want me to put you on tariffs? He, as you know, canceled the tariffs on Canada and some other of the Western alliances. So what is the idea of being an ally? Is very different in the thinking of Trump than the previous presidents. For him to be loyal to somebody means to support him when he's wrong. Because he said, if I'm right, where is kind of the difficulty to support me?
But now I would like only to add that it seems that it could be that the US will be the most protectionist country than India if they will continue like this. And then it seems to me it would be a big challenge for us to create some alliance which will face this tendency, which is unproductive for Europe, for European states generally.
No, for Europe it's a big issue. And to be honest, particularly for Germany, it is a big issue because in a certain way, Germans are right to say anything that you're accusing us of is something that you are making us to be proud of. Can you imagine in 1950s, some accusing Germany not spending enough money on weapons? So the biggest success of the Americanization of Germany was pacification of Germany. That Germany stopped being interested in a war. And then suddenly, Trump comes and said, but you're not doing this and that. And the Germans said, but are you not afraid that we can start being interested again? And I do believe this kind of a change of a game, suddenly something for which you have been praised, this same thing is the one for which you are criticized, make it so difficult for the Europeans to understand. For example, for years, United States are going to say, unity of the European Union is the strategic objective of the American foreign policy. America is here to keep European Union together. And then comes American president who starts to meet political leaders. For example, Mr. Farage, living in the United Kingdom, he's a real guy. He met other leaders just before the elections, which are not famous for their strong pro-European sentiments. And for the Europeans, the sense of betrayal is very strong. I do believe some of the European illusion is that we try to put everything that we don't like on Trump only. I do believe that there is a major transformation of the American foreign policy, and Mr. Trump has his own particularities, but not everything is going to disappear, even if Trump is not there anymore.
But it's strange, but maybe it's interesting, but Trump is maybe right, because it was really big success of US to keep Europe together. But it was in the time when Germany was dangerous after Second World War, and Russia was dangerous, but now Russia is weak. Maybe that is why not only you, Trump, but the whole US are losing interest about Europe, because they found this new challenge, which is China. But probably we are, as you said, we are not able to see it in a similar way.
No, listen, I agree. I do believe that the problem with Trump is that his intuition on many things is right. The way he is expressing his view about the world is wrong. As a result of it, for many people, it's difficult to understand that probably he has the feeling about something that Obama also agrees with. Because if you go back, you're going to see Obama's view on Europe being totally different. Obama was interested not in Europe, but in Europeans. He was interested in Europeans as the ally for dealing with the problems outside of Europe. But Obama believed structurally that in order to succeed, you should go with the trade blocs, that it's not about military alliances anymore, that the trade blocs are going to keep countries close to the United States. He is totally different with Trump, because Trump and Obama, in my view, both of them face the certain decline of the American power. It's not that the America is becoming so much weaker, but other countries, particularly economically, is going up, China being only one of them. But then how are you dealing with this situation? You're losing monopoly. And one is to try and to say, okay, let's try to fix and to discipline what I have. And alliances is the best that we have. Then Trump comes and said, why we need alliances? In a one-to-one relations with everybody, America is going to be stronger than anybody. And this is an important story. And Russia here comes also interestingly, because of course Trump, when he came, you don't need to get money from the Russians to believe that for America it's better to have Russia on their side than on the Chinese side. But on the other point of view, he missed the moment in which Russia and China went close enough, in which divorcing them is not as easy as they believe. For example, if you talk to the Russians, they're going to tell you that, yes, now we are coupled with China. And when you're telling them, okay, but this is asymmetrical relationships. Chinese are much stronger than you. Look at your economy. Look at the Chinese economy. Look what is happening in the Far East. Are you not afraid? And they're saying three things which I do believe is interesting to keep in mind. First, they said, yes, China is economically stronger than us, but we have strategic culture that is much more interventionist than there. So relations between us and the Chinese are going to be the relations between the French and the Germans. Russia being the France, and China being Germany. Secondly, they said, we want China, and we want China and Russia to go together to Europe, but we don't want to side with the Chinese in the Asian Pacific, where we want to develop relations with India and with Japan on our own. And thirdly, this is in my view the most important, we always claim that our strength with the Russian leadership comes from the fact that we share culture. Russia, nevertheless, we like it or dislike it, is a very European society. Russia said this is the biggest threat to us. If the cultural sovereignty is the most important things, Chinese does not have any cultural influence over us, while Europeans do.
Yes, but allow me, maybe the last question I would like to ask is this, this current more and more fragmented world in which this globe is the more and more terrain for game and geopolitical games of powers. If I take our experience of 20th century, I feel sorry, but it seems to me that this tendency is very dangerous for countries like Bulgaria and Czech Republic.
Oh, yeah. No, listen, I do believe that for a country like Bulgaria, nevertheless, of what people can like or dislike about European Union, to believe that these small countries can function on their own in such a big world. For example, imagine for the following. America can go protectionist. European Union can go protectionist. China and Russia can go protectionist. Tell me how Bulgaria is going protectionist. Because we talk about the return of nationalism, but there is a major difference with the nationalism from the 19th and 20th century. This is a nationalism in the absence of a national economy. I don't know the figures for Czech Republic, but I'm going to give you the figures for Hungary. 30% of the industrial production of Hungary is coming from 4 German companies. What kind of exactly national self-sufficiency you can have? So this sovereignism is a much more symbolic politics, cultural phenomena, and also basically, it is interesting, this was also my feeling that we talk certain things, but we know that they're not possible anymore. And this creates this strange story in which all of us live, particularly small countries, in a double world. Sovereignty is important for every country, but what is the meaning of sovereignty for a small country in a world in which is much bigger? In 20 or 30 years, Europeans are going to be 7% of the population of the world. Is this the same as these small imperial states that have been controlling 70% of the world? And this idea that nothing has changed because we have been before, for me, is critical. I'm going to give you one figure that has always stayed with me. Last year, Bertelsmann made a study in which they discovered that 67% of Europeans, it was in all 28 countries, believed that the world was better yesterday. Some period before, it was better. And I have a friend, famous Bulgarian writer, Georgi Gospodinov, who even started a novel on the basis of this. And the plot of the novel is the following. Imagine that European leaders now, when they go to meet on the 28th of May, decide that we don't have a view for the future, we don't know what to do, but we know that our citizens like the past more than they like the future. So which is the year in which we go back? Which is the year was the best year, but under one condition, that everybody is going to live in their own country. If you are Czech, you are going to live this year in Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia, if it is before 1989. If you're Bulgarian, you're going to stay in Bulgaria. And I was thinking very much which is this year. And paradoxically, I do believe only one year is going to fit. And this is 1989. Not because it was the richest, but because the hopes was highest everywhere. So from this point of view, what people are maximizing is hope, the possibility about the future, that the future is different. And I'm saying this because what worries me most about Europe is European society started to fear the future. Before we have been fearing the past. Now we started to fear the future. It's very difficult to be successful in any policy if you fear the future. We should learn to date the future again, basically. Having a love affair with future should be the most important job for the next European Parliament.
Yeah, but now we have to find some solution, Ivan. And now, what is your main recommendation? To endure is all, or to survive is all? What we can now?
So, I don't know. I should confess something. When I read a policy paper, I never read the recommendations. Because when this is not a joke, I'm going to tell you why. Normally people are saying interesting things, but when all of us go to the recommendation part, the level of triviality is incredible. Because it's not easy. First question is, recommend to whom? I don't believe it's abstract. It's one thing if the president of the European Commission is going to be Mr. Weber, it's totally different, it's going to be Kristalina Georgieva. This is a different person with different positions. So from this point of view, there is no abstract recommendation to Europe. What is a good recommendation? For Chancellor Merkel, probably is not a great recommendation for President Macron. And I do believe from this point of view, for me, is how to try to talk in the society in the way that we should stop thinking the future all the time as something that is threatening us, because we're doing this to ourselves. And do you know that there is a big studies showing that when there is a fire in the cinema, and you know quite often there is a lot of people dying, most of the people die not out of the kind of absence of air, but out of panic. And the real risk for Europe is that we are starting to panic. And by the way, you can panic on the left, you can panic on the right. You can panic for many things. Yeah. So this is why I'm not going with this recommendation. I do believe that there is a need for some kind of political consolidation. For sure, there should be a political leader whose name the Europeans can learn. And also he should try basically to speak to the leaders of the other great powers in the way also power speak to power. My joke was always that till recently European Union was a missionary. We believe all the time that we have a border with our future members. This is why our borders were soft borders. Probably now from a missionary we should turn into a monastery. At least a place which said, even if others does not want our way of life, we're not going to allow them to change our way of life.
So thank you for your questions, your answers, and I would like to transfer to audience, and you can now maybe to elaborate better questions. So who will start? So, yeah.
In English. Oh.
Yeah. Sorry for this. You can also do Bulgarian.
No, then I do. Then I try to make it in English. I don't want to panic because you described panic as the most dangerous thing, but still, here in the Czech Republic, the most important shift in the politics, which I can see in the recent years, is the shift from the left-wing cleavage to the cultural cleavage, to the liberal conservative cleavage. And in the way you were describing the development in the EU, it's somehow similar to me. It's maybe not so strong as here in a post-communist country, but the process is similar. The weakening of the central parties, as you described it, that's it, because the central parties, these are the so-called traditional parties who play the game of the left-right cleavage. And then you were somehow, if I understood you well, you praised the new energy which is there, which is on the streets, which comes with new movements, which comes with young people and their more radical expectation of politics and so on. But I would be afraid that this new energy is exactly the energy of the cultural fight. And I would be very much afraid of this kind of energy, because this cultural fight, it's a fight us or them. And it can be very easily energized. It can bring a lot of energy, but I find this energy politically destructive, or mostly politically destructive. So aren't we facing such a destructive process in Europe too?
First of all, I share your fears, but here's my story. What is also in crisis is the certain model of consensual politics that have been predominant for the last 20, 30 years. Even the left-right divide about which you're talking about is a left-right divide that we remember from the 1990s and 20s. Go back to the left-right divide in the 50s, 60s, or even 70s, it was not as peaceful. And I'm saying this because people, for example, now when we're talking about major destabilization of Europe, volatility and so on, compare with the 1970s. Compare with the period in which you have Red Army faction, you have a Red Brigades in Italy, you have a lot of political violence. I'm saying this. I do believe in the way you have a business cycle, and after a period of a political kind of a radicalism, people understand the dark side of it. Yes, you're getting passionate, you don't want to listen to anybody else, social media helps, either me or them, no compromise, and then people understand that this politics cannot go like this. But then you go to the other totally different direction. Consensual politics at some moment led to the fact that people said, why should I vote? I can change government, but I cannot change policy. Nevertheless, of how I'm voting, nothing is changing. I want a real alternatives. And this is part of a political cycle too. And European Union had also a very specific problem, which is not so strong in the places like the United States, for example. In order to have a common currency, we constitutionalize certain type of macroeconomic policies, which makes much more difficult to disagree on the level of policies. In a certain way, in the European Union project, 3% budget deficit is as important as the human rights. It's a kind of a constitutional precondition. In the United States, now you see certain differences. On one level, basically, you're going to have a new Green Deal proposed by the Democrats. On the other, you're going to talk about the decline of the taxes. So some of this identity politics start also to be translated much more into economic policies. Nevertheless, it's there. It's much more difficult to be done in the European Union exactly because of the fact that unlike in the Cold War, where the economy was at the center of politics, now economy is taken certain economic decision out of the electoral politics, and what remains there is identity politics. And this identity politics is very difficult and very different because, of course, you're absolutely right that it's much more difficult to have any type of a meaningful liberal consensus when people disagree about God. And this is what you see, to be honest, in Poland. It's not by accident that the major story of these polarized societies at the moment are not about economic policies. But I do believe economic policy differences are going to come through this cycle. We cannot go simply back in the 1990s, because where I do believe people are making mistakes, they are not seeing why voters suddenly stopped to be interested in politics, and for example, why on these elections they voted much more than on the previous elections. Because these elections there was a stake. You're afraid that somebody whom you really dislike is going to be elected. And this is why you go. If you don't care who is going to be elected, politics is dead. And there is one thing about populist movements, both left and right, which I found important. They believe in the primacy of politics. Go on the left. On the left, after the financial crisis, the center-leftist parties are saying, what could we do? It's a global market. We cannot do anything. And then people said, if you don't do anything, why I should vote for you? And this was the same with the migration on the right. It's a natural phenomenon. People are always moving. How we can stop them? And then basically came the populists and said, we can do something. Could they? It's one thing to stop a ship. I want to see how much. Do you know that now in America, the illegal immigration is 40% higher during the Obama years? After all this Trump talk, after all this wall, after all this saying to the people how nasty we could be, we're going to take your kids out of them, 40% more people are crossing the border of the United States than during the Obama period. So You're going to say this politics does not work. It does not work, but people wanted somebody to tell them that politics matter. Because if politics does not matter, the voter does not matter. And for me, this is part of it. Otherwise, I share very much your fears. Absolutely.
So it's very risky idea that it's something we could be grateful also for populism.
Yeah,
This maybe,
absolutely.
and maybe it reminds me Slavoj Žižek and his saying that Donald Trump is better than Hillary Clinton. It was also very dangerous.
No, I'll not go as far. Nobody can go as far as Žižek can if he wants. But the problem is the following. I do believe, to be honest, like everybody, I don't believe that if Hillary was elected, we're not going to face many of the problems that we're facing now. Because my problem with Hillary Clinton's is that she comes back and she believes that times go back.
Yeah.
And there was a major disruptions that have happened. Does it mean that we should vote for people like Trump in order to make basically the cycle going? No. But in the way the economists for a certain period believed that they're beyond the business cycles, you remember the beginning of the 2000s, we are so fine, they're not going to be business cycles anymore, they're not going bum and boost. There is bum and boost in politics. People get disappointed. Hirschman has a very important book from the 1970s called Shifting Involvements. And the book is a very simple one. 1978, he went to Paris, walking on the street, seeing people, and then said, where are all those people of 1968? He was in 1968 there, and then he sees this kind of a very moderate, very consumer society, people who were radicals yesterday, and his major explanation was the following. People get disappointed. Nevertheless, they got very much involved in public life, or if they go in the private sphere. Disappointment is the major characteristics of the human experience. So after 10 or 15 years in which people put a lot of primacy in their private life and what I'm doing and I'm not interested in politics, then suddenly you discover people that are very much interested in politics. And by the way, if you see the politics of some of the younger generation, particularly all these green movements and others, this is altruistic politics which is difficult to be sustained. It goes against the interests of these same people. Let's think about 2 or 3 generations ahead, which is not easy in a normal life. But this is this, and democracy, I could be very wrong on this, and this can end badly, I know, but you cannot allow people to live in a democracy without not allowing them to make mistakes and to pay for their mistakes. I have been studying for a year in Britain. I was very much suffering when the United Kingdom decided to leave the European Union. But I don't have a sympathy with this idea. They voted for living, but they didn't know what they do. So this is why we're not going to leave. You're antagonizing people. Allow them to go. They're going to pay for this. We all are going to pay for this. But on the basis of this experience, we're learning not to do what not to do. Probably the next time is going to be different. The fact that there is no any single party in the EU now who openly ask for leaving the Union is the result of Brexit. Yeah. And this is how democracy works. It is an educational exercise. People get certain social experience and this gets relevant. We're telling people, and this is very much European Union, you're telling people it's your choice, but if you're going to make the choice that I do believe is a wrong choice, you should redecide. And people get angry.
Yeah.
People get angry.
Yeah. Next question, please.
Thank you. So my question will be about climate changes policy. And the climate change is this a policy now for providing real steps for real changes, like modernization enterprises, update taxation policy in EU, digitalization, especially environment digitalization specific, and being more independent with energy policy for everyone. And in this question was related, what role will play that 68 Greens in EU Parliament, which shows Politica, and what kinds of role they will play on your opinion, and what level of interest will take environmental policy in EU next decade EU Parliament?
So then you have to
I'll be
address.
very clear. I don't know much about environmental policies. So, but I'm going to tell you how I see politically all this. One of the interesting things in Europe, our society is that younger generation is a small cohort. This is a major difference with 1968. In 1968, there was a lot of young people. You cannot ignore them on the ballot box. Now, particularly, let's give you Bulgaria. You have first aging society, and secondly, emigrating society. So first, for the young people, if they really don't like what is happening in the country, it makes much more sense to change the country than to change the government. It is quicker, it is easier, your life is going to be changed. So from this point of view, the problem for the young people is how you're trying to make these aging societies to change their future horizon. Because one of the problems of democracy as a political regime is that democracy is short-sighted. You think intellectual cycles. And for me, the environmental policies and the Greens and others, the most important thing that they're doing is not about simple, concrete policies. I don't know which is the right one, but pushing people to think in a long term, in 20 years, in 30 years, in 50 years. Suddenly, we start to discuss this. And this is important because democracy is about people collectively imagining the future. So the relations between generations are starting to change because people are living longer. You have a lot of older voters. These older voters are very much more often voting. They're dominating. So this is why the young people end up on the street, and for them the only way is really to scare societies. And this is important. So from this point of view, for me, this type of green radicalism is critically important because basically it changes the perspective. On the other side, you have a people, and from this point of view, the Yellow Jackets is a great example of this. So basically, you have in France two types of people, because you saw that also Greens did very well in France. You have people who fear the end of the world, and you have people who fear the end of months, because they don't have money for this and so on. Imagine the life of a Yellow Jacket person. So normally, these people are living outside of Paris because the money for living in Paris went very high. On the other side, they don't want to live in the migration parts of the city. So they are driving between 3 and 4 hours per day to go to work and to go back. For them, the money which come with raising taxes was a real money. They're going to basically have 1,200 euro, which is not a negligible money for a normal person. As a result of it, and then they look around and said, first, why they're not taxing fuel on the airplanes? Why us? And secondly, they said something which is also true. I don't drive. And because of it, I try to imagine if every day I should drive for 3 hours. The idea that you're wasting your time is physically present. You stay in the car. Talking about Russia, this was how staying in a traffic jam in Russia some years ago, I for the first time understand the major difference between the Soviet Union and Russia. The major social experience in the Soviet Union was the queue. You're queuing for buying something. Quite often you're queuing not knowing for what you're buying, but you see other people queuing. But this is true. This was not true for Bulgaria and the Czechoslovakia so much, but for Soviet Union it was. It was a major deficit of goods. What is about queue? You stay there, you're very unhappy, but you're talking to other people. It's very cold from time to time, but if you're very pissed off, you can go back home. You're not going to have bread, but you can go back home. And then imagine the traffic jam. You're in a car. It's warmer. It's nicer. You can listen to music, but you cannot go back and you go home. You are staying. You are staying for hours, and because now it's slightly better, but there was a time in which going from the Sheremetyevo airport to the center of Moscow takes you much more time than flying from Sofia to Moscow. No, this is not, there is no exaggeration on this. This is an empirical fact. So you stay in this car, and you have the feeling that your life is wasted. And you start hating people for this. Why I'm saying this? For these people, it's not about the future. This is about the feeling that their time and so on, and they're doing this and that. How to manage the Greens also to talk to these people. Some of these people are not bad people. They have a real problems. They live in a kind of a deindustrialized area. They don't know how to make a meaning of their life. And for me, this is an interesting issue. I have a sympathy for what the Greens have done in Germany, because we talk about energy. There is energy in the Green Party, which I don't see in the Social Democratic of Germany. And there are some very nice people. They're very respected people. I have a huge respect for President Steinmeier. The problem is, energy comes with an issue. Energy comes with something that certain people are very passionate about. And this is not about policy. Believe me that many of these kids who are on the streets, like me, they don't know what is the best policy, how to do it. But they know that this is important. And they want to tell the other people this is very important. So this is, in my view, this is where the importance of the Greens come. This is not simply on the level of policies, but on the level of sensitivity. Why, for example, in our countries, for example, in Bulgaria, very weak, probably they're around 1%, 2%. Why it comes and didn't work? Part of the reason is that the green movements in some of the East European countries, I don't know how it's here, they're very imitative in their character. They basically take the slogans, the policies, the body language of the German Greens. They come to Bulgaria and basically start talking the same things, because this younger generation, for them it's much easier to talk with their peers in different countries than to talk to their parents. But if you're not going to talk to their parents, there is no way that any of these policies is going to happen. And in my view, this is the major kind of a challenge. Sorry, on the policy issue, I don't understand it. I'm not against certain things being highly taxed. On this point of view, I don't believe that taxing people is killing them. But which people to tax, how to tax them, it's not where I can help you.
So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. My question is, you have talked about the Trump administration and them, Trump wanting to have a foreign policy one-to-one with every country, not having an ally. I would like to ask about the Britain. Do you think one of the reasons Britain existed was hoping to have a one-to-one relations with the US and making it more stronger, because have taken into account the transatlantic relations, which is very tense at the moment? Would you comment on that, please? Thank you very much.
No, I don't believe it, and I'm going to tell you why I don't believe it. Because the decision to exit European Union was not the decision of the British elites that are interested in foreign policy. This was interest of the British voters who are not interested in foreign policy. Of course, there is a talk, and probably many of the people who voted believed that it's going to be easier for them to have a special relations with the United States. But the famous joke in Britain is that, of course, Britain has a special relationship with the United States. The only problem is that the United States don't know about it. And this is true. I do believe that, of course, there is many things that we can talk about Brexit, and I'm not the most knowledgeable people. Two things struck me as totally very much observing the process from outside. First is the irony. For the second half of the 20th century, London was constantly in negotiations with its former colonies, where they're getting their independence. And it was very asymmetrical negotiations. London has all the trade expertise, and this kind of a colonist has just passion for independence. And now when they decided to leave the European Union, they ended up in a position of their former colonies. Because for the last 40 years, 30, Britain was not negotiating. All the trade negotiations have been done in Brussels. The best specialists, British specialists on trade, have been working for the European Commission. Do you know that 10,000 new experts has been hired by the British government in order to be able to negotiate with the European Union? I'm saying this because the second thing that came for me as a shock, and I was trying to see the Brexit with the eyes of my mother, who is a teacher in literature, not very much interested in politics. There are people who like Britain, there are people who don't like Britain. But I have never met a person who does not believe that the British elite is one of the most sophisticated elites that they have. That they know what they're doing, that they're very smart. And then, for 3 years, we are watching on a daily basis these very sophisticated people not manage to have an agreement on anything. One day, even there was a water leak in the parliament. So this idea, how you are going to respect the elites in general if the British elites cannot do it? And I do believe that this anti-establishment sentiment all over Europe was also very much fueled by this level of impotence, which you see all these people staying in this beautiful parliament with a 300-year story. We all know the story how Brits are doing, and then suddenly they cannot decide anything. They look like fools. They destroy their parties, they destroy their countries. They don't know what they want, but they want it very strongly. I do believe this was a very destabilizing effect. Nevertheless, that probably people don't talk about it. Just watching, I was seeing on myself. For me, it was a shock. I also believe that Brits know what they want, and suddenly you don't. And this was such an important moment, and I do believe this is something that is going to stay with us. Nevertheless, how the British drama is going to unravel.
And now maybe you can have a thought.
One of the often neglected reasons for rise of right-wing populism is deterioration of the political left, which is cataleptic and often unable to come up with proper policies. So where would you search for inspiration for recovery of the political left in Europe?
Listen, it's not an easy question, and I'm going to tell you why. First of all, we assume that the reasons that basically led to the decline of the political left electoral and the reasons that brought the rise of populism are the same. Does not need to be the case. Let's give you an example. One of the strengths, of course, of the European left was its relations to the trade union movement, to the size of the working class, and so on. And this changed. I mean, structurally changed. If you see how many blue-collar jobs they have been 30 or 40 years ago, go in the United Kingdom. See, part of the crisis of the European left was because of the success of the leftish policies. For example, look at education. You cannot imagine how many people get university education for the last 3 or 4 decades, and what was the major impact of this on the way the politics changed. I was seeing some of the British data. So as a result of it, you have a certain constituency that was the constituency of the European left that started basically to decline. In the beginning of the 20th century, one of the major problems the Social Democratic Party in Western Europe were facing was, should they be simply a workers' party, waiting for the workers to become a majority, or should they become a catch-all parties, basically popular parties and others? Imagine this conversation now. Imagine that they're going to be simply workers' parties. So this is one. And this decline is not the same as the rise of populism. But the second thing that happened very much was also the effect of the success. It was 1968. And 1968 was a major change in the way the left started to see itself. It was a movement from a kind of a much more socially class-based politics to the ideas much more basically identity right-based politics. And this also has to do a lot with the universities. Because one of the things that is happening in the universities is that you have a young people who for a period of time live with people their age. And this is the moment in which most of them are not married. They live in a way in which they're learning different things. They start to identify with other knowledge. So it's an emancipating, open experience, but this is very different than staying with your family and, by the way, inheriting a vote. One of the things that happened both on the left and on the right is people are done voting in the way their parents vote. But for a long period of time, this was the case. Let's give you one example. In 1988, in Greece, the biggest predicator for who is going to vote for the Greek left or Greek right was where the family was during the civil war.
If may I recommend something on this topic? It could be Didier Ribon and his return to rhymes.
Absolutely.
But we can also recommend G.D. Vance and his Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
probably the same story is
Totally.
also Mason and in post-capitalism, and his story is probably also very similar. It's also part of
very
this
much.
story
Totally.
of the left.
Extremely interesting, because Didier Ribon particularly has this point which I found fascinating, in which he said, okay, he's coming from a normal worker family. They have been voting for the Communist Party. Now they're voting for for Marine Le Pen. But it is not interesting. The problem is that his gay identity was also the way to run away of his worker's identity. It was much easier to be integrated in the bigger Paris societies and others of being gay than being basically a son of a worker. And I'm saying this because all these changes affected the left, and the problem of the left was how to reinvent itself in the moment in which the working class cannot be its base. How it reinvented itself in many places, I'm talking Western Europe, not so much our part of the world, was the following. In Austria, the Socialist Party was surviving very much because of the housing policies. There is quite a lot of basically social housing. In Vienna particularly, which allows basically the Socialist Party to keep so. But this is also the way, of course, you respond to the demand of your voters, but you try to create a culture around it. They can start benefiting from this. But the same is happening with the center-right, with the church. In a certain way, the other major pillar of the center-right was the church. And in the way the trade unions have been on the left, the church was on the right, and there was not simply voters, but there was a moral standards, there was the idea of the community that was coming. So how the left looks in the level of individualism is an interesting story. And from this point of view, America obviously went to the identity politics. If you see now the conversation about should you go after the blue-collar workers or should you go and mobilize simply the minority votes, this is it. So from this point of view, for the populists, it's slightly different. Many of the populists came to power and basically to fashion in the moment when both classical left and classical right has lost this organic basis on which they have been based. So it's not that, for example, in Austria, the Workers' Party now is the Freedom Party, the far right. If you see how many people vote for the Freedom Party and what is their background is the blue-collar workers. And this is interesting about Strache. When he's not meeting blondes, from time to time he has the policies which very much respond. There were two policies that every university-educated person is just totally kind of disgusted with, but he was fighting for them. One is the right to smoke in the restaurants. This was a major issue for the Freedom Party. In a certain way, they traded it with Kurz for changes in the tax policies. And the second was not to have any constraints on how quickly the speed on the highways. But listen, for his voters, for the workers, this is their way of life. They believe that basically if I'm kind of not allowed to smoke, I'm attacked, almost my cultural identity is attacked, and also I'm fast and I'm doing this and that. Here comes the Greens, because the Greens got the higher speed you go, the more you make it difficult for the environment to survive. If these two groups are not going to put together, and some of these people, their sons and daughters of those who smoke and go with the high speed. On the presidential elections in Austria, on the third round, because you know, the Austrians the last time adopted the Ukrainian way for voting 3 times, not 2. The most interesting group, and the most interesting was the divide between male and female, between 16 and 35. The majority of the male voted for the Freedom Party candidate, Mr. Hofer. A huge majority of the female, 63%, voted for van der Bellen. So we are talking also a totally new cultural situation in which you cannot simply tell to the Social Democrats, go to your base, because your base is not your base anymore. It's culturally not your base. But I'm not a great specialist on electorally, and also I believe that from country to country it's very different. In Bulgaria, the left is simply an ex-communist party. So they stay disciplined, and they were doing well when their voters felt threatened by the change. When they believed that there could be repression against them and so on for a serious period of time, they have been voting very kind of disciplined way for the Socialist Party. And then came the king. Mixture of the elites, nobody fearing anybody. And at the end of the day, the Socialist Party lost their support. And if you see to some of the attempts of the new left groups to go and to make a coalition with these old parties, it's also not easy. The new left and this kind of socialist voters, they don't go easily together. Because culturally they're very different, nevertheless that they basically share a name. But I don't know how, enlightening. Yes, very much.
So you have a limited amount of time. Maybe last question, if I may ask you.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I just want to go back to Romania on what's happened now today in Romania. Like Liviu Dragnea has just been condemned for all the bad things he has done in the couple years ago. So how are you more positive? Like you said, like there's a huge diaspora of Romanian people. Are you positive that there was a positive change regarding also the rule of law, knowing what Timmermans said last month, very last month, like we are in the last phase for triggering Article 7 of the Lisbon Treaty. So I'm just wondering what's your feeling with what's happening in Romania.
Thank you for this question. Being Bulgarians, we are not great on Romania. I don't know why, but we never understood. Czech Republic, I never understood. I never wrote a word about Czech Republic. So this was the easiness with which I came here. I cannot be blamed of getting anything wrong. But I do believe something important happened. When Timmermans was attacking, in my view, rightly, certain practices of the social democratic government, the biggest problem was, is the majority of the people share the sentiment? And the government was saying, oh, these people from Brussels, they're putting pressure on us. This is not how our people feel. And now you have the vote. And this is good about the vote. Because you have two of the opposition parties which get a huge support. And they know that Timmermans was right. People don't like what they see. They do believe that the elite is corrupt, and they do believe that the government is trying to protect their positions. On the other side, in order to be absolutely honest, I was also not a great friend of the anti-corruption campaigns going here and there, because most of them are concentrating a lot of power in the prosecutors, in the police, starting with the idea that these are clean institutions which are going to basically clean the other parts of societies. Of what I have seen, police and prosecution's office are not the cleanest institutions I have seen. And particularly in Russia, the joke is that prosecutor probably is the leader of the best organized criminal group in the country. So from this point of view, they should be democratic politics and not simply this institutional story matters. And I have a sympathy for the way the Romanians voted. And from this point of view, Timmermans can feel justified for what he said. People were on his side. Majority of the people.
Yeah. Thank you, Ivan, for all these answers. And now allow me maybe to make very short summary. Don't panic. All this is just democracy. And thank you for your willingness to ask all these questions and maybe to make some reflection on European parliamentary election. Thank you very much for this, and I wish you a pleasant stay here in Prague. Thank you.
Thank you very much.